Hey teachers, Sam Goulet here from Imagine Therapies. Very excited to be presenting to you tonight. This is actually the first time that we've done a recorded webinar for teacher PD, which we're very excited about. We've done lots for parents and for allied health professionals. However, this is the first time we've done for teachers. Most of the time we do it in person, as you guys probably know. I believe most of the people who are tuning in tonight are tuning in from one of our partner schools. So I just want to give out a shout out to anyone tuning in from Emmanuel Lutheran College, Pacific Lutheran College, Unity College, St. Benedict's Catholic Primary School, St. Paul's Lutheran Primary School, and Siena Catholic Primary School. All the schools that we service, we're very excited to be associated with you guys, and we're glad that we can bring this webinar to you for free. So for those of you who are tuning in, this webinar is called Helping Your Students Thrive, Being a Developmentally Conscious Teacher. What we've done is we've pulled this webinar together as we have considered some of the common issues that come up in education and some of the needs that we're seeing as school-based health professionals. Things that we can inform teachers of that will help them to, will help us to work in a better partnership for the benefit of these students. What we'll be going over, some of it is going to be really interesting, some of it is going to be concerning. And that's because we're going to talk a little bit about some of the changes that we're seeing in children's development as they come into school. It is very much what we've seen over the last, say, 5 to 10 years is a pretty interesting change in children's readiness for school. And particularly in the last, say, 5 years, we've noticed a big change in particular. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go through. I like to start off with this quote whenever we do a webinar. All children have within them the potential to be great kids. It's our job to create a great world where this potential can flourish. So for those of you who are familiar with Dr. Stanley Greenspan, he is one of the pioneers of relationship-based early intervention for children with autism. Supporting children with ASD is one of our main service areas, and so this quote kind of means a lot to us, and also for you guys as educators. You know, it is our job to create a world where kids' potential can flourish. So that's something that we really value. Now, another thing which is kind of self-satisfying, but these are my two daughters, Olive and Hazel. I try and squeeze them in every single webinar that we do because they're just so damn cute, in my opinion. I'm biased though. So this is our Imagine Therapies clinic, our head office up in Brightwater. We also have a clinic in Highgate Hill in Brisbane, in partnership with the Possums Clinic down there. They're a non-for-profit health organisation for mums and babies. At both our clinics, we provide occupational therapy, case management and holiday programs. We also work, so in Highgate Hill, we offer also speech pathology services down there. And we also work in collaboration with lots of psychologists and other allied health professionals as well. For example, down at Possums, we're also networked with a developmental paediatrician and specialist GPs, paediatric psychiatrists, and a number of other different really helpful health professionals. Like I mentioned, one of our main service areas is early intervention for children with autism and other disabilities. So we see a lot of kids come through our clinic with ASD, with developmental delays, often with neurological disorders, and a whole range of different things. One of our other main areas of service is our school-based therapy, and I've got here school-based screening in particular. So for those of you who are from one of our partner schools, we've probably recently done screening at your school. We try and get a lot of the screening done in term 1. Me personally, I've screened about 150 kids in the last 8 weeks. I'm fairly exhausted. As an organisation, we've probably screened closer to 200 just in this term, and that's across all of our 12 partner schools and early learning centres, and we've still got more to come. So another area, well, important area for us is our clinic-based therapy. So we do lots of clinic-based work and school-based work, which we really love. One of the really interesting programs that we have coming up is the Imagine Therapies Early Intervention Program. Now, this is a really exciting program, and for you guys, I'll be approaching the schools within the next few weeks, probably at the start of term 2, about possibly getting corporate memberships for this program. It's going to be really fantastic. It's basically an online training program that goes for 12 months, which educates on all of the developmental areas associated with autism. And it's going to be really fantastic, especially for the teacher aides, learning support staff, or even teachers who really just want to kind of upskill on how to support the children in their classes that are living with autism. It's going to be a really fantastic program, so stay tuned for more information about that. All right, so what we're going to be going over today is understanding occupational therapy and how it's relevant to education. We're going to understand the basic principles of child development. We are going to come to an understanding of the common areas of dysfunction that will often appear in education settings. So I'll go over with you guys some of the interesting things that I've seen in the screening so far this year, and also some other really interesting areas. We're also going to talk about developmental red flags, and then how we can effectively raise this with parents when we do observe these red flags in the classroom, and how to access support if it's needed. So we often still get asked when we say, oh, we're occupational therapists that work with children. They say, people often say, oh, you help children to figure out what they want to do when they get older. Sometimes that's true. If we really want to motivate a child and we want to say, yeah, when you grow up and you want to be a vet, you've got to be able to write. Sometimes we use that. Typically, no. We occupational therapists are concerned about occupation. So we're very similar to other allied health professionals, so very similar to a speech pathologist, a psychologist, or a physiotherapist. However, the difference for us is, where a psychologist is concerned about muscles and joints and cognitive function, and a speechy is concerned about speech and language. We're also concerned about those things. However, we are working in the context of occupation. So an occupation is any meaningful activity of daily life that occupies time. So school is one of the most important occupations of childhood. And so in pediatrics, as a pediatric occupational therapist, naturally one of our main goals is to maximize function in the school context. And so the way that we do this is by, so there's screening, but then there's assessment to identify functional deficits. So what are the actual areas of dysfunction? And then we also try and attribute that to whichever developmental area is potentially affected. And then we look at whether we need to remediate or compensate. So in remediating, what we're doing, so for example, in children with a basic motor delay, what we want to do is remediate them, so to support them to develop the motor skills that they're lacking. So we're trying to fix the problem by assisting that child to further their development in that area. When we're compensating, so that would be in the case where remediation is not possible. So for example, a child with cerebral palsy who has hemiplegia, for example, which is one-sided weakness or one-sided palsy. Basically, what we'd be doing, that is unlikely to go away. That is likely to still be a problem despite our efforts in remediating. So what we would try and do is compensate. So we'd find other ways to do the important activities associated with that occupation, so that they can still engage in those important activities. So, like I mentioned, the purpose why we work in schools is because school is one of the most important occupations of childhood. Quite often, it's as kids approach school, as they head into prep, that the demands upon them in prep often exceed their functional capacity. So where they might have been getting away with a lot of things in kindy, they get to prep, they've got the routine, the structure, the standards, the assessment, and all those different other areas. And so this is usually when we see the functional deficits come out. So the child's context, it becomes too demanding on their developmental level. There's a really interesting CDC report that came out in the States fairly recently. It outlined the fact that health is a predictor of school performance, and school performance is also a predictor of health. So there's a relationship between health and school performance. If kids are doing better at school, they're likely to be more healthy. If kids are healthy, they're likely to do better at school. The research also suggests, in terms of occupational therapy research, it suggests that collaboration with class teachers has as great a functional benefit for children as one-on-one individual therapy with an occupational therapist. So having an OT collaborate with teachers and provide one-on-one individual therapy, we're really able to, amplify the benefits of our intervention. And for you guys at one of our partner schools, I've been very blessed to be able to collaborate with you guys, with a number of clients that I've had in your classrooms. And I hope you agree that it has been very helpful for you and for those children that we see. Occupational therapy is the discipline in which healthcare and education meet. So this is where health profession and education leaders can come together and talk about common principles, things that affect both a child's health and a child's education. Okay, so here is kind of the basics of child development. The definition of development is a new stage in a changing situation. So whenever anyone talks to you about child development, I want you to think about this phrase from now on. So there's two parts to this. There's new stages and there's changing situations. A new stage is active for a child. So for example, if I take a baby out of the cot and I place them on the ground, on their tummy, what we will start to see is that baby starting to push up against the ground, lifting up their head. Eventually, we would see that baby kicking their legs, and then they would go to crawling. After they've been crawling for a while, they'll probably start lifting themselves up on furniture, and then furniture walking along the furniture. So this is an example of a child reaching new stages in their development. So they've gone from one stage to the next. So from crawling to, say, furniture walking or walking. The changing situation is different. The changing situation is passive for the child, and it's active for the parent and the caregivers in their life. So if you think about that same baby, the changing situation was taking them out of the cot and putting them on the carpet. If you don't change the situation, the child can't reach new stages. So for example, if we were to leave that child in its cot, it would probably not thrive in terms of its development. So what we would certainly see is that child being behind in their milestones. They're not reaching their new stages. Even things as even things like bone development, unless pressure is placed through bones, bones won't develop in the way that we would, that is healthy and natural for a child. So changing situations are really important, and we're going to refer back to this this phrase a number of times in the presentation. So the areas that develop, so the new stages come within the physical, cognitive, perceptual, sensory, and emotional domains. Like I mentioned, changing situations, exposure to opportunities is the key for development. Kids, like I mentioned, kids don't develop unless they're presented with changing situations that stretch them, that require more from them. Some kids have dysfunction with reaching new stages. So, for example, for some kids, you might present them with lots of different opportunities. You're changing the situation. However, they have trouble meeting new stages. So this would be a good example of a child with autism, a child with ASD. You may present them with certain situations or with opportunities to grow and to develop, but there might be other things which are more intrinsic things which are holding them back from being able to take advantage of them. So some other examples of things that can prevent new stages being reached is a lack of exposure to growth situations. There's developmental difference or delay, or a developmental disorder such as autism or other developmental conditions. Like I mentioned, helping children with their development, it usually involves remediation or compensation, like I mentioned before. So what I'm going to do is just cover a few really common areas of dysfunction in the primary years. There's no way in this presentation I could cover everything. There's certainly a really diverse spread of things that we cover as occupational therapists. I'd have to say the number one misunderstanding that teachers make sometimes is that OTs only work with fine motor skills. That's not true. So we'll go through quite a few other areas. However, it comes down to anything that prevents a child from engaging at school is something that we can provide support for. However, we'll cover fine motor skills first. So issues with fine motor skills often presents in the way the child holds the pencil or uses the pencil, the way they use scissors. We often see them being clumsy and unsuccessful for fine motor tasks. The joints tend to hyperextend. The children tend to complain about pain or fatigue during fine motor activities. And there's often difficulty with fine motor tasks like managing zips and buttons when dressing. There's quite a few areas within fine motor skills. There's dexterity, finger isolation, precision, in-hand manipulation, in-hand strength. There's quite a few different developmental areas, quite often in the very early years, so in in prep, as kids have come up from kindy, often what we see is issues with holding the pencil and in-hand strength. And we're seeing much more of that these days. It appears that sometimes, some kindies aren't quite keeping up with the requirements, that kids are needing as they're heading into prep. And we're seeing quite a few kids coming through with fine motor issues. So here's an example of dexterity. So including finger isolation and in-hand manipulation. So if you think about tying shoes, like this boy is doing down here in the bottom right, that involves a lot of isolating certain fingers, manipulating the laces in hand to be able to be successful at that task. So kids that have issues with dexterity in particular often have reduced mobility with the pencil, difficulty learning to do things like tying shoes or fastening buttons, and then difficulty picking up small objects like beads. And so the causes for fine motor skills in general, sometimes it can be a lack of exposure to fine motor tasks in their developmental history. So for example, the most common thing I get with parents when I have a conversation about this is, my son, never enjoyed sitting down and colouring with or using pencils or pens when they were at kindy. They were just never into it. They liked to kick balls and run around and things. That's probably the most common thing I get from parents. That's a little bit of a cop-out sometimes, I think. Sometimes I think, we need to be doing more with our children before they get to prep with pencils to prepare them for the prep years. For prep and then future primary school years. Other issues that can cause fine motor problems, there can be sensory issues like a lack of body awareness, and that does also commonly happen. And then low muscle tone, which we'll talk a little bit more about as we go through. And they can be some of the other things that affect fine motor skills. Here's an example of pencil grasp. So the way a child holds a pencil is fairly important. Research suggests it's less important. There was a big movement not too long ago in occupational therapy that the way our child holds the pencil is crucially important. It's something that we really need to address. Now, these days, we only really address pencil grasp if it is becoming a barrier to the child being able to write. Typically, if the child's developed a way of holding the pencil, and if their handwriting looks okay, and if they're not getting too much hand fatigue and things like that, well, then we don't necessarily need to address it. However, in some cases, so for example, in preppies, if they're holding the pencil wrong, we really want to kind of start them off on the right foot. So we may do some work with them to correct. You can see up the top here, from letters A to E, there's a few different examples of how pencil grasp develops. So, for example, A, if you had, say, a 2-year-old between 2 and 3, if you gave them a pencil, they would probably do something like A or B. As they get older, so from say 3 to 4, we'd be seeing more like C, D, and E. So different ways of holding the pencil. Certainly, when they get to kindy, we would be looking for F, G, and H, these three on the left here. And then what we're hoping is that once they get to prep, they are holding the pencil in one of these other ways. Probably in reality, if a child was holding their pencil like G, H, I, and J, so the 4 bottom from the right, that'd probably be okay. We'd probably be fine with that. That's not too bad. The ideal is what we call a dynamic tripod, which is the one right on the end, which is where they hold the pencil with their index, middle, and thumb, with the pencil at a nice, comfortable angle. Now, this means that there's very little in-hand muscle contraction, and there's quite a lot of control, considering not too many muscles are involved with using the pencil in that way. So what we would hope is that kids who are holding the pencil that way, as they get older, they're not fatiguing as much when they're writing, and that as they get older into year 6 or even in high school, and they're doing lots and lots of writing, because they've habituated a really fantastic pencil grasp, it's going to be much easier for them. Okay, one of the things that we're seeing more and more coming into our prep classes is an issue with handedness. So we also call this laterality sometimes. However, most often in Australia we call it handedness or dominant, or the establishment of dominance. So the establishment of a dominant side relates to the cerebral cortex. So that's, if you look at this picture here, that's up the top in the front. The cerebral cortex in the brain has 2 different hemispheres. So if you think about a brain, there's 2 different sides. The right side of the brain, so the right hemisphere, controls the left side of the body. The left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. So if you think about, if you've ever seen someone who's had a stroke, and they have, one-sided muscle palsy in their face, for example, so their face is drooping on one side, that means that the stroke or the vascular accident happened in the opposite side of their brain. Now, the the hemispheres develop a lot within the first 5 years. It does most of its development during that time. So between the ages of 2 and 4, what we expect is that kids begin to develop a dominant hand, or a dominant side of their body at least. So one side of their body that they preference more than the others for the functional tasks that they do. What we're seeing is more and more 5-year-olds coming into prep without very well-established handedness. And what we call this is, when there's a dysfunction, we often call it mixed dominance. So the child just hasn't quite, on a neurological level, developed a good sense of which hand is best to use. Now, interestingly enough, the issues that commonly present, this issue commonly presents in issues with crossing the midline. So if you sit up nice and straight, and if you drew a line down the middle of your body, between your eyes, down your nose, and then right down your chest to the ground, this is what we call our midline. So this is where, if you're doing an activity where you cross the midline, you're asking the hemispheres of the brain to talk to each other, so that you can still execute that movement very well. So I should mention that the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body in terms of your hands and legs, but it also processes your vision. So anything that happens within your visual field on the right side of your body is actually processed by your left hemisphere in the brain, in your visual cortex. So often in cases of mixed dominance, what we see is kids having issues crossing their midline, and then they having issues with visual tracking as well. So for those of you who might not know what visual tracking is, that's when a child is asked to sit straight with their face straight, keeping their head still, and you put something in front of their eyes and you move it from one side of their visual field to the other and ask them to follow it with their eyes. If they are able to keep their eyes on that object as it passes through their visual field from one side to the other, that's what we would call good visual tracking. What we often see in kids with mixed dominance is that they will be able to follow the object from one side of the visual field, and then it will get to their midline, and then they go bang, my eyes start swimming around, I'm not sure where this thing is anymore, and I have to refocus on it. We also see issues with mixed dominance happening in swapping hands during fine motor tasks. So for example, we see kids who perhaps are writing with their left hand. They might be writing or drawing, and then they get to the middle of their page, which is incidentally also the midline of their body, and then they go, that doesn't quite feel right, and they swap hands. That's kind of the sure sign that there's a mixed dominance issue there. Before I go past this dominance issue, this is something that can be corrected fairly easily. However, it is something that needs occupational therapy intervention to make sure that this is the issue that we're seeing. Now, the next area is visual motor integration. So I'd probably have to say, out of the 150 kids that I've screened, probably about half looked like they were at least mildly behind in their visual motor integration. So this area is similar to hand-eye coordination. However, it's more specific to copying symbols and shapes and letters. So if you think about the ability to look at a symbol or a shape, perceive its component parts, and then convert that information into a motor movement to recreate the symbol, this is visual motor integration. So being able to look at something, process it, and then turn it into a motor movement to copy it. Now, the activity that I get kids to do one of the activities I do in the screening is an activity where they have to go through a developmental sequence of shapes, which is what we see in front of us here, and it is increasing in difficulty, and I get an idea of how their visual motor integration is and if it appears age appropriate. So for example, these shapes here have a number above them. That is the average age in years and months that a child should be able to copy that shape. So for example, a lot of the kids that I've been screening, they're having trouble with the diagonal lines, the square and the X already. So even though quite a lot of these kids are already 5, they're having trouble with those areas, and then quite a lot of the kids that I've screened are still having problems with the triangle. Here's an example of the visual motor task I do with them in the screening. So you can see here, now these two kids were screened last year, but they were both screened in prep within term 1. And they were actually both over the age of 5. So we would expect them to be doing the triangle. We would expect them to be doing the triangle already. So if you have a look here, this example on the left, this child is perceiving the diagonal lines and the horizontal line, basically all as horizontal lines. You can see the diagonal lines have a slope, kind of. So it may be that that child is perceiving them as diagonal lines, but can't quite execute a diagonal stroke because of their motor coordination, or it may be that they're perceiving it completely differently. The X is really interesting. So we see an X as 2 diagonal lines crossing each other, and this child has drawn it as basically identical to item number 2 up here at the top, which was actually an X, a cross. So this X hasn't been done correctly. And then if you look down at the triangle, you can kind of see what the child has tried to do. They've done, that first diagonal stroke on the left, and then got a little bit lost from there. The one on the other side, the one that's written in green, is very interesting. So if we look at the first diagonal line, you can see that coordinating that movement was just too difficult to be able to get an accurate diagonal line. If you look at the X, you'll notice here that this child has not perceived an X as two lines crossing each other. They've actually perceived that as 4 lines meeting in the middle, and that's how they've tried to draw it. So this is where we would say that's probably more a perceptual issue. And then you can see here the square and the triangle were particularly difficult for this child. So we could say pretty much for a surety that if we assessed that child in the clinic, they would score low in terms of their visual motor integration. So the way that this presents in the classroom, most commonly it's issues with doing diagonal strokes. We often see letter formation issues, so kids compensating for the fact that they can't form the letter the typical way, so they might form it differently or strangely, or we might see letters out of proportion. Generally, we see writing being quite illegible, and then we also will probably see some issues with gross motor coordination at the same time. Not always, but sometimes it happens. So again, the causes of this, often it's lack of exposure. It's sometimes perceptual problems. It can be motor planning issues and cognitive delays, but I'd have to say probably 9 times out of 10, it's because kids haven't been given pencils in their early years, and they just haven't developed the skill. Like I mentioned, if you don't change the situation, kids don't develop. And if they've never been required to colour in a book or do any kind of drawing for a prolonged period, then they're not going to develop in this way. So a little bit more specific within the realm of visual motor integration is perception, visual perception. Now there's a few different areas of visual perception which I'll cover as we go through, but basically visual perception is the way the brain makes sense of the input that's received through the senses. So when we see things visually, so input that comes through our eyes, our brain has to take that information and make sense of it. So a few of the different areas of perception, there's form constancy. So that's the ability to manipulate forms, understanding that the object is constant even when it's obscured or reorientated. So there's for example, a child who's pre-prep or who's about 2 to 3, what we would start to see is them understanding that if we cover something, that it is in fact still there. Now, kids, if you think about babies loving the game peekaboo, now this is because form constancy hasn't developed with them yet. So from their point of view, when you put your hands over your face and you're doing a peekaboo, you're actually disappearing. So because they can't see you, they don't know that you're actually still there. And so the amusing thing is when you open your hands and they go, wow, that's absolutely magical, and they crack up. So it's really important that this form constancy develops because it's very important for reading and writing. So kids that have issues with form constancy, what we often see is letter reversals or inversions. So kids doing letters backwards or even upside down. Difficulty judging size, width, and distance. We often see kids misplacing toys and other items, not being able to find them even when it's quite obvious. And then if it continues, then we see issues going from print to cursive in, say, year 3. Very rarely do we see form constancy issues persist until year 3. However, it does happen. So if you look at this picture here, now the ones on the right, you can see there's quite a few letter reversals and writing in the opposite direction. And quite a lot of that we could probably attribute to visual perception that's still developing. Some other areas of visual perception, visual closure, so the ability to mentally complete an unfinished picture. So if you look at this example here in the pictures here, being able to look at those partial letters and understanding that, yes, top left is a G, or bottom left is an F. So kids that have trouble with visual closure, they often have difficulty with puzzles and matching games. They have issues with not completing letters when writing, so not doing finishing strokes. And they also have trouble probably reading with words that are similar. So for example, paint and pant, they will probably they'll probably think they're the same word. Now the causes here, again, quite often it's a lack of exposure. There can sometimes be a cognitive delay or a visual impairment, or sometimes, like all the other areas that we'll talk about, it can just be an individual developmental difference. We all develop in different ways and at different rates, and it may just be that this child, this is just a developmental difference for them. Another one, so figureground discrimination, so being able to locate an object within a busy visual background, difficulty selectively attending to a chosen thing from the background. So issues with this would present in difficulty writing on the line, and then difficulty reading text on a page that's busy. So I'm going to show you an example of this. Where's Wally? Classic game. Now I want you to take a few seconds to try and find where Wally is. Basically, what this activity is relying on is the person viewing to use figureground discrimination. So being able to identify Wally, wherever he is, from what's happening in the background, in a very busy background. So you can see Wally here, he's to the center of the page, bottom slightly to the left, hanging out with all his gear. I used to love Where's Wally as a kid. And it's interesting now to know that it is very dependent on an actual developmental area of visual perception. So causes of figureground issues, it can be visual acuity, it can be sensory processing issues, and we'll talk more about that as we go through. It also can be a perceptual problem or a cognitive delay or individual developmental difference. Attention problems is one that I commonly get asked about. Now, I'd say probably one of the most common questions I get asked by teachers is how long should a child be able to attend for any given age? The fact is that's a very hard question to answer because it's very dependent on quite a lot of different things. So in the literature, there's a very mixed opinion on the average attention span for any given age. However, there is kind of a rule of thumb that's been used to suggest that it should be 2 to 5 minutes times their age. So for example, a 5-year-old should be able to attend for 10 to 25 minutes. Now, you prep teachers out there are thinking, no, half my class doesn't attend for that long. Now, this doesn't mean that half your class has an attention disorder. Basically, it really depends on their interest in the task, if they're involved, if their peers are involved, how difficult it is, their experience with the task, if they're confident that they'll be able to complete it. Of course, a child who's not interested in the task at all finds it very difficult and doesn't believe that they can do it, their attention span is probably going to be more like 5 minutes on that given task. However, if it's a child who's doing something that they really love, that they feel that they're very good at, you could probably see them doing it for closer to 30 to 40 minutes, even as a 5-year-old. So it's really important that we don't mix up motivation or confidence in sticking to a task with attention deficit disorders, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Now, when we do see attention problems, when we do see something that is abnormal in terms of attention, what we would be looking for is an inability to focus or remain engaged in activities, even in preferred activities. So being unable to stick with a task, even if they actually enjoy it. We'd often see anxiety, frustration, and emotional regulation issues occur as well at the same time. And often it's really sad to see some of these kids with attention problems develop some behaviours which tend to be a real barrier to the rest of the class in the classroom. Quite often, this is not because these kids are malicious or naughty or disrespectful. Sometimes, unfortunately, their attention issues have been perceived as behavioural issues and have been treated as such. So, for example, a child who just is having trouble sticking to task, we really have to avoid punishing them for becoming distracted because they literally can't help it. What tends to happen is if they are getting distracted and they are chastened for that by their educator, they take on the identity of the troublemaker or the naughty child, and it actually perpetuates that behaviour. So what we want to do is understand that that child does have an attention problem. We do want to reorientate them to the task where we can to try and keep them on task as best we can. However, it's really important that we don't perceive difficulty staying on task as problem behaviours. Okay, it's really important. So causes of attention problems. So this is more so causes of things like ADD or ADHD. There's a very strong link to genetics. So it's more likely that your child will have ADD if you do. And I have noticed that in the clinic, quite a few kids that come in with ADD or ADHD often have parents who have the same issue. So nutrition and food is a really influential factor. So we find that many kids with ADHD, for example, are very much affected by what they eat. So lots of processed and refined sugars and things tend to make the problems worse. There is a possible link that they're finding in the research between ADHD and maternal smoking, so the mother smoking while pregnant. There's also lots of emerging evidence suggesting that ADD or ADHD comes from frontal lobe dysfunction. So the frontal cortex, the area of the brain which takes care of problem solving, planning, emotional identification, and emotional regulation, which is interesting. that is an area which is actually underactive. So a lot of parents kind of come to me and they say, oh, I've got a child with ADD, ADHD, and we went to the pediatrician and they gave them a amphetamine-based medication. And why would a pediatrician give a child with ADD amphetamines? In fact, what the medication does is it attempts to wake up this frontal lobe. So amphetamine is a stimulant. It wakes up the frontal lobe, and what we would hope is that this frontal area of their brain is able to regulate their attention in terms of the rest of their brain and what they're focusing on. So that's a really interesting thing to consider. Another really interesting point is that kids who aren't medicated tend to have brains which are 3 to 4% smaller than typically developing children or children who are in fact medicated. Now this is due to less neural white matter. So the white matter is kind of, if you think of it like long distance communication, your fiber broadband between large areas of your brain, that is less developed. However, it's interesting to note that children that are medicated actually do develop this additional neural white matter, according to some of the emerging research that's coming out. Now, sensory processing issues so this is another area of development which is becoming more and more important to consider in terms of a child's engagement in the classroom. It's very, very common that children are identified as possibly having an attention disorder by the teacher or by the learning support staff, when actually what they're experiencing is a sensory processing disorder. So sometimes kids can even go to their pediatrician, and the pediatrician diagnoses an attention disorder and medicates that child, when in fact we haven't addressed the correct area. So when considering sensory processing, this is a complex issue, guys. So it's really difficult for me to explain this within one webinar. It's probably a webinar all on its own, so I'm going to try my best. So everyone in their sensory system has preferences and thresholds. So for example, I really like gentle massage. I don't like really firm massage. I like very gentle massage, even kind of just a tickle or a stroke. That's something that I find very relaxing. My wife, though, for example, she likes very firm massage, so that's her preference. Other people, so for example, one of my colleagues, she needs to listen to music while she's working. It's just something that keeps her able to focus. For me, I cannot focus with any background noise. So I find if there's lots of background noise, then I'm closed for business. My brain stops working. So basically, every person we can kind of put into categories in terms of their sensory profile. So these are a low registration, sensory sensitive, sensory seeking, and sensory avoiding. Now I'm going to talk about these a little bit more. So the first thing to consider is a sensory threshold. So for example, you see here a glass. There's a very tall glass and then a very short glass. We all have a sensory threshold. So the sensory threshold is the point where sensory stimulation registers to our conscious thought and to our brains. Not always to our conscious thought, but always to our brains. So for example, being able to, if you think about being in a room that's dark and you slowly turn up the light, the point where you start to perceive that the light is actually on is, you've reached that sensory threshold for that sense. Now, for all our senses, we have a threshold which is related to our sensory preference. Okay, so if we have a very high threshold, so for example, my colleague who enjoys listening to music, she likely has a high threshold for auditory stimulation. And it's kind of like having a really big cup. You can fit a lot of water in before it overflows. However, for me, who finds it very difficult to focus with lots of background noise, it's as if I've got a very small cup, and just a little bit of auditory stimulation kind of sends me, makes my cup overflow, and I can't focus and things like that. So thresholds are the first thing to consider. And then we have to consider the behavioral response. So, for example, a child with autism who has a very low threshold, so they're very sensitive to sound, may either actively move away from sound or cover their ears, or act up to try and get away from the obnoxious noise. However, on the other hand, we may have other children who have a very low threshold for auditory stimulation, and they have a passive response. So they don't do anything about it. That just kind of gets them high strung, and they just feel a little bit frustrated, but they don't act on it. And what we see is a model that's called Dunn's model of sensory processing. So when we put the high and low threshold together and the behavioral response, we come up with a 4-quadrant model. So the people who have a high threshold and passive response, so top left, they are what we call low registration, or sometimes we call them sensory bystanders. And we'll talk about that a bit more as we go. People that have a high threshold and an active response, so a really big cup, and then an active response, so they like to fill their cup, they're what we call sensory seekers. Kids that have a very low threshold with a passive response we call sensory sensitive, and then kids with a very low threshold and an active response are sensory avoiders. Here's a few examples. So sensory bystanders, high threshold with a passive response. These are often your kids in the classroom who tend to zone out or daydream. They tend to be a little bit vague a lot of the time, take a long time to respond. Parents will find that they're difficult to rouse in the morning. They're usually the easygoing kids, but they can be clumsy and accident prone. They are prone also to fine motor difficulties. And often they have a few of these other things, so high pain threshold, and there can be low muscle tone and low arousal. So if you look at these pictures, Dory is kind of one of these sensory bystanders. But also, if you guys have seen one of my favorite Disney movies, Brave, which hopefully you have, it's a fantastic movie, you'll notice this young Scottish fellow down here, his name's Wee Dingwall in the movie. If you want to check out a YouTube clip, there's a pretty good example of a sensory bystander who's a little bit vague and a bit clumsy and accident prone. So feel free to check that out. Now, sensory seekers, these are the kids who have a high threshold, so a very big cup, and an active response, so they like the cup to be full. Typically, these are the kids who are very active and busy all the time, easily excited, fidgety, or have a constant need to move, attracted to certain smells and seeks them out. The ones who enjoy firm cuddles or rough play, and often these are the chewers. So kids that are chewing their collar, chewing their sleeve, chewing their hat string. Now, these are most often the kids who are misdiagnosed with ADD. So these kids have trouble focusing and concentrating because of their sensory processing preferences, not their attention in particular. So this is something that we can work with. It's something that we can compensate for and even remediate in some cases. So sensory sensitive, these are kids that have a low threshold, so it doesn't take much to set them over the edge, and they tend to have quite a passive response. So these are typically kids who are cautious or easily affected by external things. They're often easily made emotional or fearful. They tend to be detail oriented. I always struggle with that word, orientated. And they they have a pretty good ability to discriminate and focus on detail. So often these are artists. They tend to have a high level of awareness, but they become distressed in noisy environments. And at times they can appear kind of high strung. So what I usually find is that the sensory sensitive kids in the classroom are typically the ones who are getting toward the end of the day and they're just kind of getting a little bit anxious because the classroom's getting a bit noisy. These are your sensory sensitive kids. And then we have sensory avoiders. So these are the kids that have a low threshold, so a small cup and an active response. Basically, I'm not going to go through all of these, but they tend to have quite high arousal. They're high strung. They're anxious kids. They avoid sounds. They avoid messy play. They have trouble with, they tend to be picky eaters. And quite often the sensory avoider it can be associated with conditions like ASD, like autism. Not always, certainly not in every case, but quite often in kids with ASD we see they can be sensory avoiders. However, they can also be all the other areas. What causes sensory processing problems? There's individual developmental differences. There is some suggestion that genetics may be involved. There is a link between sensory processing problems and premature birth. If there's a developmental disorder or trauma or low muscle tone, they can also be contributors. Now we're running out of time, guys, so I'm just going to fly through the rest. So posture and upper limb endurance and stability issues. So this is kind of the core, around the abdomen and back, the core and postural strength, which allows a child to sit up straight. And often issues in this area will present as kind of a slumped posture. There's restlessness, inattention, or the children are constantly changing seated position. It's interesting. I observed a classroom this term at one of our partner schools. They had a particularly large amount of kids that appeared to have poor core endurance and postural stability issues. And these kids, they were sitting on the mat and they were just rolling all over the place, having real trouble sitting up straight. And so we were very excited to implement some whole class strategies to kind of build their core strength over the next term or so. So milestones, guys, are really important for you guys to know. So every time you enter a new year, I'd really encourage you to look up the developmental milestones associated with that age group. So these are just, if you want to write down some of these links, then feel free. These are the Queensland Health Developmental Milestone Checklists. They're really fantastic, and I'll show you an example in just a moment. But it's really interesting to note, when you take a child through and you do the activities on the checklist and you check how they are. You prep teachers out there, it'd be very interesting for you to get an idea of how many kids in your class are likely behind in the developmental milestones. We conducted a research study in collaboration with Good Start Early Learning, where we screened quite a large number of the kids in the kinder year. And what we found is that a third of the kids that we screened, so over 200 kids, a third weren't on track for prep, which is really concerning. And it's something to be very aware of. So this is what the milestone checklists look like. There's a column on the left that says an average child can, and these are what the milestones are. On the right, there's signs of possible problems, so potential red flags. So the red flags we'll talk about now. So in 1777, that's the earliest recorded use of the term red flag, and it was used as a way of signalling warning. We use this again today when we're considering developmental red flags. It's warning signs that there might be something that needs further examination. So certain behaviours, attributes, characteristics that indicate some kind of developmental dysfunction. Here are just some examples of common red flags in the primary years. Like I mentioned, we are running out of time, so I won't go through and read all of them. However, some of the most important ones are the ones that we've basically covered in this presentation already. So have a quick read of them. So when to seek help, red flags at any age. This is really important for everyone to know. Children who aren't reaching their developmental milestones, kids who have limited eye contact. If there's any significant regression in a child's skills, that's a real red flag. If we notice that there is a significant lack of response to sound or verbal instructions, that's quite often something that would mean that they need a trip to the speechy. If there's poor interaction with adults, if they're not using a dominant hand by the age of 4, or if they're loose or floppy or have difference between strength in either side, that's something to consider as a red flag that needs to be immediately raised with an allied health professional or medical professional. Now, it is always a challenge to approach parents with developmental issues. So we still have problems with this. And, in our time doing screening, even when parents pay out of their own pocket for the screening, sometimes they can become quite defensive when we raise the results with them, and it's not something that they were expecting. So I guess number one is always avoid suggesting that a child has ADD or ADHD or ASD. I haven't yet seen an occasion where that has gone down well. Most teachers, especially those in our partner schools, I feel don't do this, and I'm very proud of you for doing it. However, I have noticed there have been quite a few teachers who I've come in contact with at other schools, including state schools, and they have kind of said to a parent, "Oh, I think your child might have ASD or ADD." I haven't seen that go down well. The best thing to do is to encourage parents to see an OT. So perhaps just calling the parent or having them in for parent-teacher interviews and just highlighting with them that you are seeing some things which are different to the other kids in the class, and then giving them a way that they can get an idea of the severity of the issue by seeing an OT for an assessment. It's always more beneficial if they come to see us before they go to a pediatrician in every case. The reason why is a pediatrician won't always make the call on the first visit. So it may be that the parent goes, they pay for a private pediatrician, costs $350 for the 15-minute consultation, and they don't actually get anything out of that first consultation. The pediatrician decides that they want to see them a number of times. If they instead were to come to an OT and get a assessment and a report completed, what they're actually doing is walking into that pediatrician visit much more prepared. The pediatrician can see that that child's been evaluated by an allied health professional already, and often they'll be able to make the call on the spot with regard to a diagnosis rather than waiting and reviewing and things like that. If we, or for those schools who aren't one of our partner schools, if there's another service that is screening at your school, the screening is a really fantastic opportunity to raise that there's an issue with the parent. We're here to serve you in this way. So, if you raise a child who you think has an issue and we have the opportunity to screen them and we detect the same problems, we can be a tool we can raise the issue with the parent. So every child that we flag in a screening, we call the parent directly and have a personal conversation with them. And often, we can report that back to the parent, so you don't have to do it as explicitly. It's really important that teachers are really clear and upfront with parents, from term one. If you're seeing issues in the classroom, don't avoid talking to the parents about it. Keep them in the loop, because if there is an issue identified and it's already term 3, they tend to go, oh, well, I didn't have any idea this was happening before. Why don't I need to now? So also encourage the parent to come and participate in the classroom so they can see for themselves. That's a really good strategy that I've observed. So parents, they can actually come in and they can view their child in the classroom, and then indirectly they can kind of see, oh yeah, well, my son does jump around a lot and he does do this, or his handwriting is quite a bit messier than the other kids. That's often a good way to address the issue. So how to get advice, especially you guys who are from one of our partner schools, our door or our phones are always open for you. So feel free to shoot us an email or give us a call, even if you just have a question, or if one of our OTs are coming out to your school, just catch one of us there at the school, and we'd be more than happy to chat with you about the issue. You can also check out imaginetherapies.com.au. There's some awesome resources on there. However, I think our website is still having some maintenance done in preparation for the early intervention program I mentioned before. However, there's also some really good resources on the net. So Mama OT is just a blog from a mum who is also an OT, and she has some really good ideas on there. There's also Handwriting Without Tears. So they're a company in America who specializes in teaching kids handwriting from using developmental principles. So there's some really fantastic resources there too. Now, the University of Sydney also have a Compass program. Now, this is a little bit tricky to find, but if you go to this link, you'll be able to find a list of resources. So there's some really fantastic things that I assume they're students that have put them together under the supervision of someone certified. But there's some really fantastic resources that teachers can use. So if you go to the University of Sydney, so if you Google University of Sydney Compass program, and then go to the programs tab, and then the teachers tab, and then the resources tab, what you find is a whole list of really fantastic resources that can be really helpful. So like I mentioned, if you guys would like to ask questions, feel free to shoot us an email or give us a call. Otherwise, we look forward to working with you in the future at your respective schools. We are very appreciative of all the hard work that you do, and we're very pleased to have the privilege of working with you. If there's anyone tuning in who from a school that we don't service, if you don't have an OT currently coming to your school, please encourage your learning support or your principal to give us a call. We'd be more than happy to look into being a service provider at your school as well. So thanks everyone for tuning in. I'm Sam Goulet from Imagine Therapies, and I look forward to our next webinar. See you later.